Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Friedrich Pollock, the Éminence Grise of the Frankfurt School by Philipp Lenhard. This chapter is titled A Friend for Life. When the Pollocks moved to Stuttgart in March 1910, Friedrich was 15. Forced to leave his friends in Freiburg behind, Friedrich now had to find his bearings in the new city. Friedrich Pollock's friends organized a small send-off for him and gave him a transcript of the gathering as a farewell gift. A plentiful musical offering, including works by Bach, Vivaldi, Mozart, Schumann, and Wagner, alternated with the recitation of poetry. As Horkheimer's biographer, Ernst von Schneck, has noted, the assemblage of selected texts can be seen as, quote, a kind of group manifesto. Reichert's, quote, Chitter, the ever youthful, end quote. Schiller's, quote, the pledge, end quote. Hamlet's monologue, Lessing's ode, quote, a friend's farewell, end quote. Pollock, known to his friends as ʻpɔlɔks, P-O-L-L-U-X, enjoyed reciting poems and reading plays in character. The prologue to the transcript of his farewell do stress the prologue to the transcript of his farewell do stress his skills in adopting a variety of voices. Quote, who was it who, above all others, gave each role a new guise, a new character, end quote. At school, Pollock seems to have been good in maths, and there is also mention of his extraordinarily good memory. After a visit to the opera, quote, be it Valkyria, Tiefland, Strauss, end quote, he had always knew the main tunes by heart. Yet none of this was enough to get him into the higher secondary school, gymnasium, in Stuttgart. His marks were too low, and he was sent to a commercial college, which suited his father's plans better anyway. Here the classes were socially more diverse than they were at the elitist, culturally more aspirational gymnasium. Friedrich Pollock was suspicious of the children from the families with whom his parents socialized and weary of their inflated sense of self. Adolf Löwe, 1893 to 1995, whom he would later befriend, is a case in point. The son of a wealthy businessman, Adolf Löwe was 1 year older than Friedrich and attended the Real Gymnasium, a form of gymnasium that focused less on the classics and placed greater emphasis on maths and modern foreign languages, in Stuttgart. On the 18th of January 1911, now in his final year, Löwe spoke at a ceremony to mark the 40th anniversary of the creation of the Imperial German state. In his pompous address, he waxed lyrical about the Germans, quote, liberating awakening from a long leaden dream, end quote. Quote, the various parties were reconciled. Finally, we were one people again, end quote. Friedrich would not have dreamt of engaging in this kind of conformist swagger. Much to the annoyance of his parents, Friedrich Pollock wanted little to do with the bourgeois children of their neighbors and became increasingly introvert and defiant. Of course, this may also have been a response to the overall change in circumstances resulting from the move to Stuttgart. The family's relative prosperity notwithstanding, their new residential arrangements were inferior to those they had previously enjoyed. In 1908/1909, the Pollocks had finally vacated the flat above the store in central Freiburg and moved into a villa located on Dreieckigstrasse 13 in the much more prestigious Werra district south of the river. In Stuttgart, they lived in a flat again, located on Rheinsbergstrasse, in the immediate vicinity of the travel goods and suitcase factory on Vroylenstrasse. In the winter of 1910, Friedrich Pollock received the following entirely unexpected and oddly stilted letter addressed to, quote, "Dear Mr. Pollock," end quote. Quote, "Since we began to establish our dance class," end quote, it read, quote, "we had hoped that you might participate in our little winter amusement. Yet back then our hope was in vain, from what I understand. You assumed that you would not be in our beautiful city at the time. A few days ago I heard from Mr. Eisenman, who will now be here this winter. After all, it might not be averse to the idea of spending one evening a week with us learning to dance. ... I hope this might be so, and that we might welcome you to Olga House tomorrow evening at 8:45. Yours, Max Horkheimer," end quote. Max Horkheimer was the only son of a Kommerzienrat, parenthesis, literally Counselor of Commerce, an honorary title awarded to prominent businessmen, end parenthesis, Moritz Horkheimer, a respected pillar of bourgeois society and the observant member of the Jewish organization, of the Jewish congregation, making him, in Pollock's eyes, one of those spoilt scions from a respectable family whom Friedrich Pollock viewed with suspicion. They had never met, though they might have seen each other from a distance once or twice, since that their parents were loosely acquainted. Horkheimer's friend, Walter Wolff, who originally suggested Pollock as a possible participant in the dance class, likewise came from the refined haute bourgeoisie. Pollock had hardly been yearning for a dance class, not given the extent to which dancing lessons were, quote, "a mark of the refined middle classes," end quote. Pollock had begun to despise so intensely. To make things worse, the participants were all sons of prominent members of the Jewish congregation and, though a Jew by birth, Friedrich Pollock had no interest in Judaism, let alone in Judaism's institutionalized form. When, in the event, Pollock did give the dance class a try, Pollock took an instant dislike to Max Horkheimer. Quote, "He drove me mad, and I joined forces with a number of discontents, and we were in the process of setting up our own dance class and leaving Horkheimer and 2 or 3 of his chums behind," end quote. When Friedrich Pollock became aware of the conspiracy, Horkheimer, who was not used to this kind of rejection, was deeply upset. Max Horkheimer went to see Pollock, who at this point still lived in a recently constructed western suburb of Stuttgart, and asked him for an explanation. Quote, "And he said to me, quote, 'So listen, I am of course aware of what you're planning, and this is all down to the fact that you don't really know me. I'm not at all the person I seem to be. I'm an extremely desperate person. If someone doesn't help me soon, I'm going to go mad,' end quote, end quote. Pollock was totally surprised to see before him not the overbearing son of the Kommerzienrat he had previously met, but an entirely different, weak, and profoundly human Horkheimer who was vulnerable and sought help. Even so, Pollock remained suspicious and merely agreed to give the matter some thought. Shocked by the renewed rejection, Horkheimer left. Had he not, after careful further consideration, given Horkheimer another chance after all, Pollock's life would likely have taken an entirely different course. They became friends and soon entered the fray as the inseparable duo they would henceforth be. In a first joint act, they were now the ones who sabotaged the dance class by turning their backs on all the other participants. Before long, they decided to place their friendship on a robust footing in the form of a friendship contract. It is presumably no coincidence that, as the sons of entrepreneurs, they create a contract to assure each other of their mutual loyalty and dependability. Yet there was much more to this contract. They regularly renewed and supplemented in subsequent decades with memoranda and psychological reports they wrote about themselves and each other. At its core was a utopian program. Quote, "We consider our friendship," end quote, they wrote in the original document which, unfortunately, has been lost. Quote, to be the highest good, that it lasts until death is inherent in the concept of friendship. Our conduct shall reflect this relationship of friendship, and all our principles will take it into consideration before all else." End quote. For them, the contract reflected, quote, "a critical and human zest," end quote, that sought to, quote, "create solidarity among all human beings," end quote. It laid out in detail how they would lead their shared life, including specific times for the days for discussion. In reality, the life of the two friends continued to be rather more prosaic for the time being. While the Horkheimers' great wealth was occasionally reflected in the lifestyle of their son Max, for the most part, the two newfound friends' daily lives did not differ substantially from those of their peers. They gathered around a bench in town or in a cafe to discuss, quote, "the pointlessness of our parents' lives," end quote. The gathering revolt against their parents was typical of many growing up in respectable, well-to-do families whose ability to gain autonomy depended, in good Oedipal fashion, on their ability to challenge the dominance of their fathers. And as the children saw it, their parents led one-dimensional lives, quote, "constantly preoccupied with how to amass yet more money," end quote. To this capitalist ideal, the two young friends juxtaposed a moral vision of equality, truth, and fidelity, and solidarity they were intent on implementing in their friendship. Implied was not least an extraordinary level of exclusivity. Quote, "I'll be in Stuttgart on Thursday," end quote. Horkheimer, on holiday in Bregenz, wrote in September 1912, quote, "I'll call you as soon as I get home so we can arrange to meet. If I might ask a favor, don't tell anyone I'm coming. I want to be able to spend the first couple of evenings just with you and not end up having Stuttgart's jeunesse dorée dropping by," end quote. That means golden youth. Jeunesse dorée, golden youth dropping by, end quote. The next step of the revolt consisted in reducing their exposure to their parents. In 1912, both Pollock and Horkheimer faced the prospect of being apprenticed in their parents' businesses and set on the very career path they so desperately wanted to avoid. They found a way out by suggesting that they should begin their training by gaining professional experience and language skills as interns abroad, and their parents eventually agreed. The parents vetoed the den of vice that was Paris and would have much preferred to send them to Manchester as a true industrial metropolis. In the end, they agreed on Brussels as a compromise. Horkheimer was assigned to a manufacturer of ready-made clothing, and Pollock to the substantial l'Innovation department store, his father's principal Belgian customer. Receiving what was for interns a handsome monthly stipend of 400 Belgian francs, they were able to live comfortably in Brussels. Having come to Brussels first, Horkheimer booked lodgings in adjacent guest houses and waited impatiently for Pollock to arrive. On the 10th of May 1913, Pollock wrote from Stuttgart how happy he was, quote, "that we are now making our getaway together," end quote. 4 days later, Horkheimer replied that, quote, "I don't want to wake up again until you arrive, but what can I do? There's another 12 hard days to go," end quote. Some formulations in their correspondence would not be out of place in a love letter, and there is no doubting its homoerotic overtones. It would seem that in this regard, Horkheimer occasionally went too far for Pollock's liking. He knew, Horkheimer wrote on one occasion, quote, "that you do not like it when I write like this, but I am sick and it helps me," end quote. They by no means limited their enthusiasm to each other or the same sex, however. Horkheimer, for example, was infatuated with his childhood friend, Elisa Rosenstrauss, who, alas, had no idea, quote, "just how much I care for her," end quote. Pollock, too, used the opportunity to gather first experience with the opposite sex. The two friends regularly took young women out for dinner, frequenting high-class establishments such as the Taverne Royale in the Saint-Hubert Arcade. The women tended to be young shop assistants whose salaries barely sufficed to make ends meet, and who would never have been able to go to the theater or to restaurants unless invited out. As the sons of prosperous entrepreneurs who cut a rather dashing figure at that, the role of the suave and generous gentleman came naturally to Pollock and Horkheimer. Pollock had a fling with the much older housekeeper of his landlord, Dr. Moskowitz. She, quote, promptly fell in love with the slim and evidently still quite inexperienced young man, end quote. One day she placed a finger on his mouth and told him, quote, he should come with her, and he went with her, and she led him to a door and told him to look through the keyhole, and there he saw Dr. Moskowitz amusing himself with a female patient, end quote. At a time when sexual activity was still much more of a taboo than it is today, encounters of this kind were doubtless quite formative for Pollock. In the event, then, Brussels was not so much where they implemented the, quote, solidarity of all human beings, end quote, outlined in their friendship contract, but mainly a social space in which the two young men were able to gather new experiences and escape their parents' repressive sexual mores. While discussing what a more meaningful existence might look like and searching for it in literature, they conducted themselves much as one might expect of wealthy bachelors who can afford to ignore the misery around them. They were particularly attracted to naturalist and symbolist literature. Its anti-bourgeois tenor and negation of traditional gender roles ideally suited the sensibility of their intimate and devoted union. Henrik Ibsen's plays emerged as an important focal point for their quest. They positively devoured Enemy of the People, first published in 1882. Wikipedia says An Enemy of the People is an 1882 play by Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen, followed his previous play, Ghost, which criticized the hypocrisy of his society's moral code. The response included accusations of both Ghost and its author being, quote, scandalous, quote, degenerate, and, quote, immoral, end quote. In An Enemy of the People, a man dares to expose an unpalatable truth publicly and is punished for it. However, Ibsen took a somewhat skeptical view of his protagonist, suggesting that he may have gone too far in his zeal to tell the truth. Ibsen wrote to his publisher, quote, I'm still uncertain as to whether I should call, bracket, An Enemy of the People, end bracket, a comedy or a straight drama. It may, bracket, have, end bracket, many traits of comedy, but it also is based on a serious idea, end quote. Back to the text. An Enemy of the People's main protagonist refuses to go with the flow and denounces society as being founded, quote, upon a quagmire of lies and fraud, end quote, insisting that the prevailing, quote, compact liberal majority, end quote, was, quote, the most dangerous foe to truth and freedom, end quote. For Pollock and Horkheimer, the, quote, enemy of the people, end quote, was a role model. He was despised by the masses but unwavering in his crusade for truth and freedom. No less appealing to them was Ibsen's portrayal in Ghosts of the family as a veritable prison, based on domination and repression. According to Wikipedia, Ghosts is a play by the Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen. Ghosts was written in Danish and published in 1881 and first staged in 1882 in Chicago, Illinois, U.S., performed in Danish. Like many of Ibsen's plays, Ghosts is a scathing commentary on 19th century morality. Because of its subject matter, which includes religion, venereal disease, incest, and euthanasia, it immediately generated strong controversy and negative criticism. Since then, Ghosts has come to be considered a, quote, great play, end quote, that historically holds a position of, quote, immense importance, end quote. Theater critic Maurice Valenci wrote in 1963, quote, from the standpoint of modern tragedy, Ghost strikes off in a new direction, ... Regular tragedy dealt mainly with the unhappy consequences of breaking the moral code. Ghosts, on the contrary, deals with the consequences of not breaking it, end quote. Ibsen disliked the English translator William Archer's use of the word, quote, ghosts, end quote, as the play's title, as the Danish or Norwegian Gangera would be more accurately translated as the, quote, revenants, end quote, which literally means, quote, the ones who return, end quote. Back to the text. No less appealing to them was Ibsen's portrayal in Ghosts of the family as a veritable prison based on domination and repression. Ghost's main protagonist is haunted by the ghosts of the past who will not release her and eventually destroy her life. Ibsen's Wild Duck, moreover, expressly treats the relationship between two friends. Wikipedia says, The Wild Duck is an 1884 play by the Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen. The Wild Duck explores the complexities of truth and illusion through the story of a family torn apart by secrets and the intrusion of an idealistic outsider. The Wild Duck focuses on Ekdal family, whose fragile peace is shattered by Gregers Werle, an idealist who insists on exposing hidden truths, leading to tragic consequences. The play was written in a realistic style, but literary scholars have pointed out the play's kinship with symbolism. It blends themes such as deception, betrayal, and the disillusionment of modern life with moments of comedy and satire, and is considered the first modern masterpiece in the genre of tragicomedy. The Wild Duck and Rosmersholm are, quote, often to be observed in the critics' estimates vying with each other as rivals for the top place among Ibsen's works, end quote. Themes of visibility and recognition permeate the narrative, featuring characters struggling to be seen while metaphorically and literally blind to each other's true selves, symbolized through motifs such as blindness, photography, and the wounded wild duck. Like other Ibsen plays, it is rich in references to Ibsen's family, with, quote, old Ekdal, end quote, widely considered one of the most famous literary portraits of the playwright's father, Knud Ibsen. The character Gregers Werle represents the spirit of the Paus family and Upper Telemark, a broader theme that is found in many of Ibsen's plays. Back to the text. One of the two main protagonists, Gregers Werle, wants exactly what Horkheimer and Pollock are too trying to create, a friendship founded on truthfulness that is free of lies and deceit and oblivious to the charm of vapid trinkets, a friendship in which each is at all times willing to sacrifice his life at a drop of a hat for that of the other. Narratives of this kind allowed Pollock and Horkheimer to idealize their hedonistic lifestyle. They thought of themselves not as two spoilt scions of the ruling class, but assumed they were making a difference by conducting themselves as they did. For them, Brussels was the counter-location to the factory, where Stuttgart stood for the narrow-mindedness, tyranny, and deceit of bourgeois society. The Belgian capital embodied a life of freedom, pleasure, and truth. While some political statements expressing disdain for oppression and exploitation, notably in Horkheimer, do exist from this early period, the two friends were principally concerned with their own lives at this time. Disagreements with their parents and their attempts to assert their intellectual independence from them overshadowed all else. They neglected their internships but eagerly learnt French with their private tutor, Monsieur Cal, a retired civil servant from the Loire region, whom they adopted as something of a father figure. Yet that was not all. Pollock led the way in making the first forays into philosophy. Browsing in a bookshop with nothing particular in mind, Pollock came across a number of reduced philosophical classics. Quote, this was Spinoza. As a Jew, I knew something about Spinoza, then Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and Schopenhauer's The Wisdom of Life. Pollock began to read, but neither Spinoza nor Kant resonated with Pollock. Quote, And then I read Schopenhauer, and here was suddenly someone who spoke plain German and treated issues of concern, what an individual is, what an individual stands for, etc. Enthused, Pollock presented the book to Horkheimer. Quote, "You're always giving so much thought to the world," end quote, he said. Quote, "Perhaps this will interest you," end quote. A few days later, Pollock acquired 6 leather-bound volumes of Schopenhauer's collected works in the city's German bookstore, and the great pessimist of German philosophy henceforth accompanied Pollock and Horkheimer for the rest of their lives. Yet their interest in philosophy was, as yet, limited. Schopenhauer spoke to them primarily because he unflinchingly pointed to the meaninglessness of life, yet far from embracing misanthropy, they continued to consolidate their friendship as an alternative, ostensibly meaningful life plan. It is unclear how much the parents knew of their son's conduct, but the business partners for whom they worked presumably reported back to them. In late 1913, their respective parents decided that Friedrich Pollock and Max Horkheimer should leave Brussels and go to Manchester, the European textiles capital, where they were expected to find new internships and learn English. They tried to revive as much of their Brussels lifestyle in Manchester as they could, yet this was easier said than done. Other than their long walks, now along the Mersey, and their profound deliberations about the meaning of life, or lack thereof, the hypocrisy of bourgeois society, and the barely concealed materialism of their parents, there was little they could simply emulate in Manchester, and they soon grew bored of the city. Culturally, it had little to offer that appealed to them, and its overwhelmingly proletarian character, all their empathy for the exploited workers notwithstanding, simply did not resonate with them. Of course, Pollock and Horkheimer were not alone in nurturing ambivalent feelings towards the working class. Leo Löwenthal later expressed this ambivalence as follows, quote, "To the extent that they still exist, proletarian ways of life by no means offer a desirable model. Post-proletarian, i.e. petit bourgeois, ways of life are not really all that much better, but they do, in terms of their essential core, imitate upper-class ways of life," end quote. Still the quote. "I would go so far as to say that luxury is an anticipation of utopia. Marx too might have been able to formulate some thoughts in a better and more differentiated manner had he not been so poor," end quote. Leo Löwenthal. Pollock and Horkheimer's contempt for bourgeois society and bourgeois society's materialism certainly did not translate into a yearning for asceticism or some kind of simple life, and they became increasingly convinced that the goal surely needed to be the equal distribution of the material surplus so that all could share in the benefits it afforded. It was wrong to monopolize and enjoy one's undeserved privileges without giving them another thought, to be sure, but it would be much worse still for the privileged to go around in a sackcloth and ashes, thus mocking the desperate desire of the poor and exploited to share in society's wealth. This first crucial step towards a critical theory of society was, however, still closely connected to the anti-bourgeois thrust of naturalist literature, and lacked any kind of substantive grounding in philosophy, let alone in the critique of political economy. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche were exceptionally gifted polemicists, who identified contemporaneous social trends with great acuity. Yet they were also nihilists who showed little interest in the question of how the world might sensibly be organized, the very question that increasingly crept up on and unsettled Pollock and Horkheimer. In this regard, the literature they were reading certainly offered no answers. Having spent less than 2 months in Manchester, Pollock and Horkheimer moved to London, where Pollock and Horkheimer rented a small flat in Hampstead, which, at the time, was up and coming, but nowhere near as exclusive as it is today. It was the exact opposite of Manchester. A fashionable spa in the 18th century, it was now a leafy suburb with excellent connections, both by overground and, since 1907, by underground, to central London and its many attractions. The move to London had also marked a caesura in that a young woman now joined their covenant. On a trip to Paris that Horkheimer undertook on his own while they were still in Brussels, Horkheimer had fallen head over heels in love with Susanna, quote, Souza, and quote, Neumeier, a distant French relative. In subsequent months, Horkheimer repeatedly visited her, and Horkheimer continued to do so after they had moved to England. Horkheimer offered a record of the short but intense encounter with Neumeier in an avowedly autobiographical novella appropriately called L'île heureuse. Where am I?
L'île heureuse.
The island happy is what that means. Bearing in mind that he doubtless stylized the experience in the novella, it nevertheless complements what we can glean from other sources about the episode. It was not long before Horkheimer urged Pollock to allow Susa Neumeier to become part of their compact. Fearing that a third party, and a woman at that, might stand between them, Pollock was skeptical. Pollock, quote, was sullen and cold as the ocean bed, end quote, and nearly drove Horkheimer to despair. Yet when Horkheimer's enthusiasm was still unbroken 3 days after his most recent date with Neumeier, Pollock relented. Neumeier had repeatedly told Horkheimer that she felt like a prisoner in her parental home and found society's norms and expectations crushing. The two friends had assumed they alone felt this way, and they were surprised to discover that another person shared their sentiments and yearning. Even so, Pollock was uncertain whether this commonality was sufficient to underpin the principles laid out in their friendship contract. Pollock apparently suggested that Horkheimer should write Neumeier a long letter explaining once more the conditions attached to admission to their covenant, which Horkheimer did. Quote, "There could no longer be any misapprehension. I told her absolutely everything and revealed every last secret about us," end quote. Neumeier responded in a letter she signed with her blood, quote, "I am your body and soul," end quote, your plural. Thus, her decision to join the covenant became to stick with the contractual terminology legally valid. In May 1914, Pollock and Horkheimer took the train from London to the northern French coastal resort of Fort Mahon and met with Neumeier. The title of Horkheimer's account, L'île heureuse, was taken from a poem by the French Jewish symbolist Ephraim Michel. Not seeing anything for him on Wikipedia, who lived from 1866 to 1890, that Emmanuel Chabrier, the quote, new Offenbach, end quote, had set to music and greatly impressed Horkheimer. Emmanuel Chabrier, which means it's probably actually Chabrier, I said Chabrier, but it's Chabrier probably, lived from 1841 to 1894 and was a French romantic composer and pianist. Emmanuel Chabrier's bourgeois family did not approve of a musical career for him, and he studied law in Paris and then worked as a civil servant until the age of 39 while immersing himself in the modernist artistic life of the French capital and composing in his spare time. From 1880 until his final illness, Chabrier was a full-time composer. Although known primarily for his two orchestral works, Espagne and Joyeuse Marche, Chabrier left a corpus of operas, including Les Étoiles, Étoile, I don't know how to say that, in parentheses, songs and piano music, but no symphonies, concertos, quartets, sonatas, or religious or liturgical music. His lack of academic training left him free to create his own musical language. unaffected by established rules, and he was regarded by many later composers as an important innovator and a catalyst who paved the way for French modernism. Chabrier was admired by and influenced composers as diverse as Debussy, Ravel, Richard Strauss, Satie, Stravinsky, and the group of composers known as Les Six. Writing at a time when French musicians were generally proponents or opponents of the music of Wagner, Chabrier steered a middle course, sometimes incorporating Wagnerian traits into his music, and at other times avoiding them. Chabrier was associated with some of the leading writers and painters of his time. Among his closest friends were the painter Edouard Manet, and Chabrier collected Impressionist paintings long before they became fashionable. A number of such paintings from his personal collection by artists known to him are now housed in some of the world's leading art museums. He penned a large number of letters to friends and colleagues which offer an insight into his musical opinions and character. Chabrier died in Paris at the age of 53 from a neurological disease probably caused by syphilis. Back to the text. Its final stanza reads, quote, "But yonder under the sun Its final stanza reads, quote, "But yonder under the sun the precious and radiant red land appears, from whence the song of a joyous new dawn sounds. This is the happy island in the cloudless sky, where among the unfamiliar lilies, in the orchards, I will sleep in your embrace." End quote. The affinity between the hopeful and alluring, almost messianic mood expressed in Michael's poem and Horkheimer's portrayal of the atmosphere among the three friends in Fort Mahon is palpable. Quote, "Here we sat on the hot sand of the dunes, our eyes blissfully taking in the deep blue sea stretching out before us, our souls filled with unbounded joy and our chests bursting with love beyond the words for this glorious radiant nature, and for ourselves who were free and had shed all that was alien or base. Nothing now stood between us, no interest, no reservation, no honor, no dignity, and no duty. Each saw the other only as the totally free human individual, whose innermost character they had come to know, to whom they were forever joined, and with whom they had attained these heights. We must ascend yet further, to learn to understand and enjoy the world more intensely, conduct ourselves more and more in a way that is good and true." End quote. No less palpable is the affinity between Horkheimer's use of the literary metaphor of the happy island, with its occasionally enraptured visions and contemporaneous life reform movements of the kind that met in the tiny hamlet of Monte Verita in Ticino, where anarchists, vegetarians, theosophists, and artists of various stripes assembled and engaged in newly invented rituals to celebrate the unity of blood and soil, spirit and nature. According to Wikipedia, Monte Verita, or Mountain of Truth, is a 321 meters above sea level high hill and cultural historical ensemble in the Swiss canton of Ticino. The site is in the municipality of Ascona, about half a kilometer northwest of the old town. Monte Verita, located on Lake Maggiore, was a well-known meeting place for the life reformers, Lebensreform, and pacifists, artists, writers, and supporters of various alternative movements in the first decades of the 20th century. After 1940, the place lost its importance. An attempt at a revival in the late 1970s met with very limited success. Murit Verita was originally the name of the local, quote, nature healing sanctuary Sun Sanatorium, end quote, established on the hill Monte Manesia, and can be found for the first time in a brochure published in 1902. In the period that followed, the name Monte Verita was also transferred to the entire hill formerly known as Monte Manesia. Back to the text. In marked contrast to those who gathered on the mountain of truth, Pollock, Neumayer, and Horkheimer's island got by without eurythmy, working the land and the rock of Valkyrie. But central tenets of the life reform movement are nevertheless clearly discernible in Horkheimer's account. Quote, the fact that Sousa was a woman, bracket, vibe, end bracket, rendered our connection more coherent, self-sufficient, and whole. We could devote our entire humanity to our covenant. Our soul, intellect, and body were no longer beholden to the outside world. Every aspect of us, even our common urges, were assuaged among us, since Sousa took pleasure in being able to gift us her sensual beauty, end quote. Far from least, inspired as it was by libidinous fantasies of wholeness, their covenant also amounted to a neurotic adventure, to be sure, but their worldview, Horkheimer occasionally referred to it as, quote, our religion, end quote, nevertheless amounted to rather more than the sublimation of sexual fantasies. The development of an independent consciousness and options for a good and truthful life continued to form its centerpiece. They passionately discussed and planned, often until dawn, what they wanted their new life to be like. At one point they considered running a farm in South Africa and subsisting purely on what the land yielded. This yearning for a simple earthly existence pervaded the entire spectrum of life reform movements, from folkish German to Zionist, regardless of the individual group's specific ideological orientation. Given that it was soon unable to compete with Pollock and Horkheimer's penchant for their privileged lifestyle, their rejection of their parents' values notwithstanding, this new and ultimately uncharacteristic programmatic tenet was short-lived, however. The ménage à trois fully came into its own in June 1914, when Neumayer really did manage to get away from her parents and joined Pollock and Horkheimer in London. They were finally reunited and free to live as they pleased on their île Heureuse, albeit not for long. Neumayer had left her parents a farewell letter explaining her intentions. Armed, they immediately contacted Horkheimer's parents, who, in turn, alerted Pollock's parents to what was going on. Pollock's mother, who knew no English, took her son's address on Castle Road to mean that he was in prison, parenthesis, Castel being a German word for a fort, end quote. She wrote to him, affirming how much she loved him and promising to stand by him no matter what he had done. Julius Pollock was altogether less understanding. Together with Moritz Horkheimer and Neumeyer's father, Julius Pollock traveled to London and even involved Scotland Yard in his search for the unruly youngsters. One evening, Neumayer and Horkheimer had gone out and only Pollock was at home. The doorbell rang unexpectedly. Pollock opened to find two, quote, sinister-looking, end quote, policemen at the door, who informed them that an arrest warrant for what was then called the white slave trade, i.e. the trafficking of women, had been issued against him. Pollock was not in fact arrested, but he was prevented from leaving the flat in question. Fortunately, the three fathers soon arrived, followed not long after by Horkheimer and Neumayer, and the matter was resolved. Pollock and Horkheimer were forced to return to Stuttgart and enter their respective family businesses. Neumayer burnt all their letters and declared that she was no longer wanting anything to do with their covenant. Pollock and Horkheimer were profoundly shocked. That their shared life in a European metropolis had come to an end was bad enough, but it was the treachery, parenthesis, as they saw it, end parenthesis, of Susanne Neumeyer's abrogation of their friendship covenant that profoundly wounded them and impressed its mark on their future lives. That's the end of chapter 2. Thank you for listening.